Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, Burnham and Louise Haigh have unveiled their plans for funding devolution. But do they stack up? A number of Burnham's new ministers have had their historic statements on the Gaza genocide highlighted. Spain's army tries to stop Moroccan migrants entering its African enclave. And Diane Abbott has finally been readmitted into the Labour Party. I'm Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by Paul Holden. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me back. Like the shirt.
A lot of people have been commenting on it. It's tarot cards, so if you get bored with the show, you can read your future. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments below. We do this all for you, and we want to know what you think. Prime Minister Burnham has begun to unveil his plans to devolve both political and economic power from London to the regions. And the way he plans to do it seems, on the face of it, relatively uncomplicated. According to plans published last night, the Burnham government will allow regional mayors in England to retain a share of taxes raised in their areas. In a statement, Burnham said this: "I said we'd take power out of Westminster and carry it into every postcode in the country. Today, we made good on that promise. Under our plans, more of the taxes raised in a community will stay in that community. Soon, every local leader will have the power and resources to improve public transport, build homes, and create jobs. I know what it's like to be ignored by politicians in Westminster. I'm not going to make that same mistake now I am PM. The whole of government will now pull together behind the people and places that desperately need our support. This is how we'll bring back hope and bring power home to you." Now, as with many of these announcements, there isn't much by way of detail yet, with the government press release saying this: "From next spring, mayors will begin retaining a greater share of locally generated revenue, starting with business rates. Further details on this and on income tax retention will be set out in a roadmap at the budget and will be underpinned by the government's firm commitment to fiscal discipline. Over time, local areas will move away from dependence on Whitehall grants and towards funding that rewards local growth. Regional mayors will start being able to keep a share of local business rates by 2027, according to the plans, and a share of income tax by 2028. Now, this isn't going to be any new money, though, but it is going to replace grants distributed by the Treasury. And we don't yet know the size of the share that mayors will be allowed to keep. That's something that Chancellor John Healey is set to announce in the budget, which he announced today will be on the 28th of October, in the middle of half term. Still, some mayors are already celebrating. South Yorkshire Mayor Oliver Coppard told The Guardian this: "It's really important because it gets us out of the death grip of the Treasury and gives us that long-term certainty around income." According to The Guardian, a reliable projected income stream will have an additional benefit for regional governments, with the paper saying this: "England's directly elected mayors, who control areas spanning 3/4 of the population, would be able to use the revenue generated from business rates and income tax as they wish, including tax breaks for important industries or rebates to residents. However, experts said one of the most significant consequences was that it would allow combined authorities to take out 30-year loans against their projected income to fund major projects that previously needed Treasury approval. Local leaders will also be given more freedom to operate independently of central government, with Transport Secretary Heidi Alexander saying the threshold at which local leaders need to seek Treasury approval for projects will rise from £200 million to £500 million. On the morning news rounds, First Secretary of State Louise Haigh set out a little more detail on how it will work.
Income tax and business rates will still be set by the UK government centrally, but different areas will be able to retain a share of those, and that will give them an incentive to grow their economy so that they can then keep a share of the proceeds of that growth and reinvest it, so it becomes a virtuous circle of investment. You see this happen really successfully in countries like France. I was in Lyon not very long ago, where they retain a proportion of their tax intake and then they can invest it, and they have world-class integrated transport systems in cities that are far smaller than ones here, where we don't have anywhere like the kind of investment that they enjoy.
So what about areas? I'm thinking we've got a mayor of London, the wealthiest city in the country. That would get a proportion, that the same rules apply, so it would get the proportion of income tax. Yet if you go to a region elsewhere in the country which won't have that same income tax, it won't be getting as much money. Is that fair?
Yeah, correct. So areas will retain different proportions of their income tax and business rates. That's exactly how it works at the moment, with some business rates retention, and that's offset by central government funding. So it will be offset by proportional formula that's set centrally to make sure that funding is still fair and equal across the country, but it will crucially give them that incentive to really grow their economy, create extra jobs, invest in their businesses, and ensure a thriving local economy that they can then recirculate the revenue from into investment in their area.
So Haigh is right that what's being proposed is actually fairly standard in other G7 countries. The BBC reports this. The share of national taxes collected at a local level in the UK is 5.8%, the lowest in the G7 according to the OECD. That share is far below that of other countries with large economies such as France at 20.4%, Japan at 36%, and the US at 45.7%. Paul, maybe you're going to surprise me, but I can't find a lot to disagree with in this. I mean, obviously, there's very little detail. We don't know what proportion of these taxes local governments, local mayors will be able to take. There's also this calculation that will determine, that perhaps richer cities get less of a share than poorer areas. But is this the right direction of travel? I mean, I'm presuming you're going to say yes.
No, I feel like I have to do devil's advocate and say no and make up some nonsense argument as to why it's a bad idea. But I mean, I think generally speaking, most people accept this idea that that localism is a good way of governing. That generally speaking, the decisions that are sort of regionally driven, where people have a direct influence over their own unique economic circumstances, generally produces better democratic outcomes. I think that's pretty widely accepted, not least in, and it has to be said that this country is deeply and profoundly centralized. It really is, like a very, much more so than other countries. London and the Treasury and Westminster exercises vast control over the day-to-day life of huge numbers of people. And there is this real sense that there is, a deficit between what people around the country think is good for them and what Treasury does. And there's really the sense of a local politics being stifled. I mean, I think it has interesting implications, So first of all, the one caveat I would say, the one negative thing I would say, is that just because governance is local doesn't necessarily always mean it's going to be quality governance, right? Because you can have bad local government. And
you can have corruption and all kinds of things going on at that level.
Yeah. And one of the issues that I think will have to be looked at when it comes to local government is the extent to which you've had regions and cities which have effectively become de facto one-party states, which are very problematic in terms of corruption, right? So and it doesn't happen as much anymore. Well, certainly of the last local elections, it got a bit more untidy because the Greens surged. But for a long period of time, you had, large parts of this country where local government was effectively run by a single party. So the Labour Party, for example, had 15 out of the 60 councillors in Newham, would have 70 out of 72 councillors in Newcastle. And that can breed a problematic situation where, the party itself, which can be quite dysfunctional, produces a dysfunctional selection of councillors who then don't represent people, and then it becomes a very problematic space for corruption. But that's true of sort of every level of government, right? So that's the one caveat I have. Is localism I think is generally a good idea, but I also think there needs to be a discussion about how we improve the quality of local government and how we, it might be that the way in which our local elections are structured needs to be rethought, so you don't have a situation where one party dominates, because it really is problematic. I think the exciting prospects are things like, you compare Sadiq Khan to Zohran Mamdani, right? You could actually have, under this model, it is believable and credible and imaginable that you can have a form of actually effective municipal socialism. Right. It does actually give the scope for you to do the Preston model in plenty of different places. It does actually give you the scope for mayors like Zohran Mamdani to emerge as national political players. The question would be, would anybody takes up that opportunity and runs with it? But it could be really interesting in terms of shaping our sort of national political conversation.
And also, mayoralties will become a much hotter political race, right? Everybody's going to want to be the mayor of somewhere, because you'll have a bit of what Burnham had in Manchester, but everywhere, right? Where you've got a sort of great deal of power, you've got an independent budget and so on and so forth. It can be very attractive. One of the things I thought was really interesting is this idea of like enabling borrowing. Because obviously that could be quite large amounts of borrowing based, over 30 years for a region based on its tax revenue, so an easy calculation more or less to make. Is it kind of a way of getting borrowing in for infrastructure, but not via central government's books, perhaps?
Yeah, and that again, that could that's the one thing you read out. I was like, that's actually really interesting.
Yeah.
That's like really transformative. You can actually have large scale local borrowing. Again, I'm going to sound like a bit of a warning.
And everyone's going like Birmingham, I
well,
guess.
Actually, my thinking, I've been reading a lot. I'm going to totally forget its name, but I've been reading a very interesting book about Manchester recently, which is about, looking at the history of Manchester over the last 100 years, and takes that to the current cycle. And it looks at basically the development of Manchester over the last 20 years under Andy Burnham, which he sort of runs on as like, I've brought prosperity to the city. And of course, the picture is a lot more complicated, where effectively what you've had, according to a more cynical and more sort of a left-wing analysis, is that, well, you've actually had a lot of state money, effectively loans being granted, development loans granted by the state and the local government to private entities, which have built these massive tower blocks and effectively turned it into a rentier city.
Pretty much one private entity is
Readmitted, right? Yeah, which is the main ones. They've got £200 million out of the 400 million that's been loaned out. So, these are all good things. It's good to have localism. I do worry that like so much of Britain's, this is all happening in the context of a broader macroeconomic situation where the returns for capital are always better when it comes to building rentier housing than it does when it comes to actually building, if it's going to be investment driven, that's going to be, and it's investment driven around housing, that's going to potentially have perverse outcomes. If it's instead used to be like, we're now going to build 100,000 actually council-owned properties, that's transformative. If it's combined with other thing I think is interesting, which I think is maybe they need to be seen together, is the plans for the National Care Service. Because the key drain on local budgets is care.
Yeah.
So if you have a National Care Service and then you have local fundraising, suddenly you're going to have these mayoralties and these local councils, which actually for the first time probably in 40 years will have the budget to spend. And they could spend that money either catalyzing rentier style investment, or they could be building council housing, or they could be building integrated infrastructure, or positive opportunities, but which you basically need like local political activism to take.
And of course, like local political activism is easier at the local level, right? You're much more likely to influence your mayor or your local council than you are to the national government.
That's an interesting. I'm not so sure how true that actually is.
Right. It must be. I feel like it sort of has to be a priori true.
I suppose. I mean, you'd think it would be, right? But then I think of my experience, and like the dirtiest, the ugliest part of the Labour Party is like a councillor level. Like that's where it's like tooth and nail nastiness, and also the pettiest stuff, right? Because that's like that is the hardcore. These are people who have like given their lives. They want to be politicians. They can make some money off it. They can make money off being councillors, but they can also then, benefit potentially from, maybe I'll be able to become, the owner of a parking lot, or, I'm going to be controlling zoning, that sort of stuff. There is scope for personal enrichment there. And you'd think that like localized democracy would be better. But if it's localized democracy being enacted through a one-party state, through a dysfunctional party, then it's actually dysfunctional.
Sure. I agree with that.
Then it's actually quite hard.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's going to have to, one of the issues around local democracy that we have is like the death of local media, which is really profound. You have a couple cities where it's surviving and it's thriving, and a lot of places it's not. And that's, that's one of the things that generally militates against like a degree of accountability. So I'd be interested to see whether now there's money returning to these places, whether that will then fund organically an emergence of an alternative or new local media. Because there used to be, you'd have like local newspapers, The Reach, Liverpool Echo, great investigative papers, like actual, really good. Now sadly, they've been like really hollowed out.
Yeah.
Pretty much only owned by one.
Also,
one
BBC
entity.
local journalism completely wrecked. Yeah.
So all potentially positive, but these are the things that we have to like deal with. Is that we will then. there has to be a commensurate commitment to being like, well, you actually need to improve the quality and the ability of people to engage in the local democracy for localism to work.
Great. Okay, let's move on with this story. Now, this plan for a bit of economic devolution is intended to free regional mayors to stimulate their own economies by investing in things like infrastructure and the infrastructure that best serves their communities. But some think it doesn't go far enough. Mayor of Tees Valley and Tory peer Ben Houchen said this: "I'd rather ministers just cut out the middlemen and lower taxes. But if they're handing me a share of the income tax raised on Teesside, true devolution means the decision where to spend it is for locally elected leaders. I want to give every penny back to the workers who earned it through a rebate scheme. If people don't like that, they can vote for someone else. That's what real accountability looks like. But today, Westminster decided it knew better, as it always does." Now, if reporting from private eye is to be believed, and, I don't know whether it is, Houchen may in fact be a pretty good counter-argument to devolution. This relates to the Teesworks Freeport in Teesside, the development of which has been dogged by allegations of lack of transparency and poor value for public money. This is from Richard Brooks, writing in Private Eye in 2025. It was to be the UK's largest regeneration scheme in decades, a model for regional devolution and the flagship post-Brexit Freeport. But the redevelopment of the former steelworks on the south bank of the River Tees became little more than an unlawful, taxpayer-funded scheme to promote the political career of a Tory golden boy and vastly enrich a couple of local businessmen and their families, all hidden in a web of deception. Don't hold your punches, Richard. In 2024, an independent investigation into the Teesport development found that deals had been done in secret, public funders had been misled, the private companies involved had made zero investments into that scheme, and there was no evidence that it represented value for money for the public. Now, it's important to point out that there were no findings of criminality or corruption or dishonesty. Louise Haigh had this response to Houchen's rebate proposal.
At the moment, that's not how it works. They have lines of funding and they go in, that's how it's invested into public services. We've seen what the mayors have said about rebates. There's not a system that would currently allow that, and they certainly wouldn't be able to set tax rates locally or regionally. But we'll consider what proposals are put forward. The real purpose of this, though, is to allow areas to benefit when they create growth, when they create new jobs, and to keep investing in their local areas, in public services, in transport, and to keep that virtuous circle of investment.
I suppose, though, the point is that if you're giving power to localities, and that's very much what you say you want to do, then you would have to give them the power to do things that you might not necessarily approve of, you as a Labour Party. Are you willing to say, yes, if Ben Houchen wants to do something differently, if the Mayor of Cambridgeshire and Huntingdon, who we talked to earlier on, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, if he wants to do things that he wants to do, then we are willing to allow those people to have the freedom to do things and to see whether they work.
Well, that's exactly right, and we can't sit back and allow this country to remain the most centralised in the G7, which has held back our growth and our productivity and held back investment levels because we worry that certain parts of the country might elect different political parties to our own.
I mean, call me naive. I sort of feel like it probably won't work like that in the end. Excuse me. But I think there is something to be said about, perhaps as a way in which when you inject money into these regional areas, when you allow them to keep some of the money that they're generating in order to spend locally, it does give bad leaders in those areas enough rope to hang themselves with and be elected out, so long as there is an opposition to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting because when I first read the story, I thought that actually Louise Haigh was saying, no, we're not going to allow that to happen. It actually basically seems to be, she seems to be suggesting, well, if that's what you want to do, on your head be it, your local voters will hold you accountable. And I think they would hold them accountable.
All she said there is there's no mechanism to do it.
But then she does basically say, we will bring forward the proposals and we'll discuss it. It's not a hard no. I mean, I think it would be a little bit mad to basically be like, here is 20% of your, here's a massive whack of money. Just give it back as tax rebates to already wealthy people instead of investing in infrastructure. Yeah. I suspect there'll probably be slightly more controlled than that. But the point stands, and the point that I was making earlier, and again, I think it's useful to bring up Houchen and the Teesside development. And I really would encourage people to go and read that Private Eye report, which is actually on the Private Eye's website still. It's one of the few things you can still read. And that is a scheme where really genuinely vast amounts of public money have gone into it. And there've been a handful of people who've put in very little of their own money and have made fortunes, over 100 million. I think it's 135 million pounds that this group of business people and their families made. It speaks to, localism is good, but local neoliberalism is going to be bad. You can have, just because it's local doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have good outcomes, right? I feel there became a bit of a thing in the Labour Party and the soft left, this idea, people who didn't want to make sort of overly tendentious arguments about the nature of the political economy, about the status quo, would start talking about localism as if it was this radical get out of jail free card. If you give people local decisions, then they'll do socialism on their own. We don't have to defend it. That's not necessarily true. But what it does show is that it doesn't, it's going to be the content of that local government that matters. If you have poor quality, if you have a neoliberal local government, it's going to be a neoliberal outcome, which is going to be problematic, which is actually, ironically, the argument that underpins a lot of the critique of Manchester at this point, which is that, Manchester, on the one hand, has had a tremendous amount of economic growth. This completely different city centre to what it looked like 20, 30 years ago, but it's all privately owned. It's all rental based. It's created huge amounts of displacement. It's increased rents pretty much across the whole of Greater Manchester. And we even saw during the Makerfield by-election, there was a lot of sympathy with people standing up and being like, this stuff was happening in Manchester, but none of it's actually made our life worse, because all it's done is basically push problems from the centre out towards the periphery, and it's made everything more expensive. So again, it's great, localism is fantastic. Great to give people more power. If the people are Tory bastards who want to give it to their mates, this is going to be a bad thing. Then you have to suspect that, one advantage of hyper-centralisation is if you centralize everything, then audit functions become centralized, and then you can have a very tightly controlled system. So you'd have to imagine that if you're going to have increased expenditures, you are going to have to make sure that in Darlington they have more people working in the audit office. Otherwise, it really will be a disaster if they don't do that.
Well, I think Burnham was part of this announcement was a kind of whittling down of the civil service in the centre, to other parts of the country.
Yes.
I would say on the neoliberalism in Manchester, one of my favourite journalists on this, who I've been following for ages, is someone called Zoe Bread on Instagram and TikTok. Starting off with wrong parking tickets, moving on to skyscrapers, and now onto warehousing, ruining people's property prices, and just sort of dumped there. So Zoe, if you're watching, get in touch. Let's stick with. Oh wait, before I go on, I wanted to ask you something else. I mean, look, let's go to the politics of this. There's no details here, but we've basically had 2 weeks now, in which Burnham has, on a day-to-day basis, made some kind of announcement, which is pretty pleasing to a lot of people. The detail is yet to come, but bus fares, care service, more money for regional governments. He's doing a pretty good job politically, right? At this point.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the metric is what is a good job. If the metric for success is he's doing popular things and is being popular and is increasing the Labour Party's poll ratings and his poll ratings, then yes, he's succeeding. I don't pass judgment on whether this stuff is going to be good from a left wing perspective. Sure. That's a whole other argument. He is. I think he's learned 2 lessons. I think there's been 2 politicians who've basically shown you how to do it and how not to do it. Yeah. And the politician who showed you how not to do it is Starmer and McSweeney, who did the most misery guts tour, which most people sort of deep in their bones understood was deeply misleading. And there was this real sense that the Labour Party said that we can change things, and then basically we had the last 20, 30, 40 years of government has been, sorry, the computer says no. We can't actually make your life better, and Starmer did that again. And the one person who, I think is undoubtedly the most talented politician of our generation is Zoran Mamdani, undoubtedly. And the thing that always strikes me about Zoran Mamdani is his ability is that it feels like everything is strategically oriented, that he spent years and years and years with his colleagues thinking about a strategy for how to govern. And one of the things they've come up with is that you have to immediately do big things on a day-to-day basis and be communicating on a daily basis a good news story of some kind. Mm-hmm. The problem is you actually have to be doing stuff that is good news.
You have to be making good news.
You actually have to be making good news. Yeah. So the thing that why Zoran Mdani works is he's both a very effective communicator, but he's done great things.
Yeah.
Right, like he's done the Peter Ted attacks and he's done, bringing in free childcare. You can't, the centrist learning of this is going to be, you should just be talking to social media every day. So if you're talking to social media every day about how you're not going to be closing the carried interest loophole, you're screwed. You actually have to be doing things that people like. It also shows, I think Burnham is just proving this ungovernability thesis. Like there was the sense of it's all falling apart. We're all fracturing. No, we just had really crap politicians for a long
terrible
time.
Leaders. Yeah, because you say it as like, you say it as though this is easy and obvious, but nobody has done it. I can't remember. I mean, Corbyn maybe in that 2019 manifesto, but obviously the country rejected it. But I have not seen this kind of sense of people need things, let's give them to them.
And I wonder whether I was thinking about this later, what is the difference between, why is Burnham, for the first time, I think, ever since an election or since a prime minister's come in, I was looking at the approval ratings, Burnham's at plus 19 at the moment.
Yeah.
Which in this, Starmer was never a plus 19, no. Never once. Rishi Sunak before then, we basically had a good decade where our politicians were pretty much hated.
Yeah.
Not for bad reason. And I do wonder whether he's obviously had an inbuilt advantage, which is basically he hasn't been in opposition. And I do think that makes a difference. I do think there is something about being in opposition for multiple years that crushes the spirit of most people. And they're also restrained. I feel like the act of being in opposition is the act of various elements of the British state coming to you and telling you, you better shut up, you better stay in line, you can't actually do that. You go to 13 different business meetings with salmon and smoked eggs, offensive, and, various hedge fund people telling you, if you increase my tax by 1.2%, I'm moving my family to France and I'm going to tell all the other. He hasn't gone through that process. He hasn't been disciplined, but also he has a total fresh slate to set a message. This is all very advantageous. Bad for democracy, that the way he came to power, I think. But those are the inbuilt advantages he has, and to his credit, he's taken them and run with them. Another
advantage he has of not having been in Parliament for a long time is he has no record that people can present to him as hypocrisy or going back on because he hasn't said anything really.
Yeah.
So
it is helpful. Basically, what we need is all politicians who need to be elected in the country, both national and local, should have their brains wiped and be a tabula rasa, and then that's how they should govern.
Well, we should just pick randoms for Prime Minister.
By sortition.
Yeah.
Love this idea.
It worked so well in a recent party. Let's stick with the Burnham government for a moment. Earlier this month, Andy Burnham said this about Keir Starmer's handling of Israel's assault on Gaza.
I know many people feel that at the start of Israel's military action in Gaza, my party didn't get it right, and I am sorry about that. The response has too often not been good enough. We need to do better. Yes, we have taken some important steps. These include recognising the Palestinian state, placing sanctions on Israeli ministers and imposing waves of sanctions on violent settlers and the organisations that support them. I also fully support the restrictions on arms licences to make sure that no British bombs or bullets can be used by the IDF in Gaza or in the West Bank. But let's be honest, the UK was too slow to call for a ceasefire, and we must now do more to strengthen our approach. Israel continues to violate the ceasefire agreement, killing innocent Palestinians. We're seeing a surge in settler violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the continued expansion of illegal settlements, displacing Palestinian communities. And Netanyahu's government is clearly attempting to make a two-state solution impossible. That's why we need to do more, which includes looking at further sanctions, both on those involved in the violence in Gaza, but also looking at measures to ban trade in goods with illegal settlements. I, like many people, feel passionately about Gaza, and I will do everything I can to work with international partners to stop the suffering, to ensure the Israeli government adheres to international law, and to keep the prospect of a two-state solution alive, because this is the only way to lasting peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. I have been absolutely appalled by what I've seen and read about the destruction of Gaza. there's increasing evidence that war crimes appear to have been committed. There must be accountability for the depth of the suffering the people of Gaza have experienced. Ultimately, however, it must be for the international courts to determine rather than politicians.
So quite a lot of words there about things he will do, like constrain the Israeli Strait. Good luck, mate. But the important thing I think there was that bit at the end where he talked about how, for him, evidence is mounting that shows there could be war crimes, but this is for courts to decide, which will only happen after the event, which means it's too late for anybody who is war crimed. Anyway, the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign has today released a video, and it shows that some of Burnham's new crop of ministers just don't agree with that thought, that politicians shouldn't decide whether war crimes have been committed by Israel in Gaza.
It is impossible to conclude that this is anything less than a genocide. So on that basis, will he reflect the will of this House to the Foreign Secretary and to the Cabinet to impose immediately sanctions on Netanyahu and his genocidal regime?
Genocide is not something we can only recognise when it's politically convenient. As a signatory to the Genocide Convention, we have a legal obligation to call out and prevent genocide.
We owe it to not look away from the devastation and to bear witness to what has been inflicted on the Palestinian people. We owe it to bear witness to this history, to this ongoing genocide.
Until the international community take further action, Netanyahu's pursuit to ethnically cleanse Palestine will not end. And the horrors of genocide become the waking nightmare for those still alive to witness it.
The Minister knows the gravity of the moment that we are in: famine, ethnic cleansing, genocide. He knows that our actions must be equal to the scale and the gravity of the moment.
Genocide.
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 Andy Burnham, it is a genocide. And it's time for action. Sign our petition. Sanctions now.
Paul, interesting there. So you've got Andy Burnham saying, we've got to leave it to the courts to decide whether there are... He didn't even use the word genocide. He just said war crimes, whether war crimes are being committed in Israel, which they so obviously are. Obviously, I think that this is obviously genocidal behavior on the part of Israel, but I can see that, other people might think differently about it, whatever. War crimes, I think, there's no debate about that. And then you've got a number of his new ministers, who have in the past just openly called it a genocide in Parliament. I wanted to bring this up because I was wondering what you thought about the tensions in this new kind of regime, the Burnham regime, between those who, taken a very clear position on Israel and what should happen in terms of Israel, and those in his cabinet who are up for having old ladies locked up for holding signs, for supporting a group that's been prescribed, in other words, Palestine Action, whose prescription they think of as wrongful. They're not themselves necessarily even supporting that group. They're just they're opposed to the prescription for lots of different reasons.
So I think there's a whole bunch of things to unpack there. I mean, the one is, first of all, unfortunately, the people that they've put up in that video are very junior. The only exception is Louise Haigh, who's obviously he's very powerful and
very significant job, and obviously a very close figure to Burnham.
Yeah. And but the rest are really not. There's a sort of third level ministerial appointments. They don't carry a huge amount of weight, and they're very much they were released in the third round of announcements, as I think pretty much everybody sort of understood them to be sops to the left, to be you're not being entirely excluded. The balance of actually his cabinet is very much not reflective of a pro-Palestine position at all, and almost everybody in his cabinet right now were people who've defended and supported both the prescription of Palestine Action and have said pretty awful things on Israel. So I mean, regardless of Wes Streeting's bizarre text to Peter Mandelson, he said the ICJ judgment and the ICJ process was a distraction, right? This is something that he said.
I think when recently asked about war crimes here, committed by Israel, he said something like, yes, we've got to keep our friends in line when they step out of line.
Yeah, that's like absolutely ridiculous that you know, as he's coming defense secretary. So my sense is that the people who would be presenting a countervailing opinion are relatively marginal in his cabinet. That's not to suggest that there's other people in his cabinet like Shabana Ahmed who aren't going to be feeling local pressure because, you know, she might lose her seat and so might wear streets around this issue. But I do think that this is where Burnham's going to be bad. Like, this is where I'm going to break it to you. Like, this is where Burnham is going to be bad. Because this is the decision that he's made. This is the way that he's decided to govern. And I think it's pretty clear the way that he's done this. He's basically said, I'm going to have like a pretty forward-looking, progressive domestic agenda. I'm going to touch nothing internationally. I'm going to do exactly what's been done up until this point in time. I'm going to do, I'm going to increase defense spending, even though it's a disaster to increase defense spending. I'm going to actually increase our interdependence with America through defense spending, even though it's obviously a shocking idea from a security perspective. I am not going to significantly increase the amount of money we spend on climate change. I'm actually even going to, reallocate some money that's supposed to be used for international fight against climate change to domestic priorities, which is one of the first ways that he funded one of his new announcements. And I think because, inside the Labour Party and inside their strategizing, segmentation analysis is a big part of how they perceive the world. And there was recently another policy debate around, how does the Labour Party win the next election? And effectively what's been happening, the standard Labour Party segmentation analysis of Britain separates Britain to 6 to 8 segments, and then they pretty relentlessly target one or two segments who they call vote and will win them an election, especially now that the whole election has become so fractured. And I think it's very clear that they have what segment they've chosen. They've chosen the segment that's represented by Makerfield. And that's what used to be called, in segmentation analysis given different names, one of which is the patriotic left. Now, this is people who are older, who are white, they're working class. They're generally not, quite a few of them will own a small property. They're not like, they're not destitute by any means, they're not poor by any means. But, they will obviously have felt the cost of living impact on their abilities to live their lives to the fullest. They'll be experiencing a loss of holidays and like a loss of luxuries, and increasingly like some foreclosing of the sense of their life and the life of the generation below them is getting better. But this is also a segment that's open to ideals, like is open to the idea of having like a nationalized post office and a nationalized rail service. They're like big state interventions. They have a fondness for the NHS. They have a fondness for like the post-war settlement. But they aren't particularly they're weak on issues on immigration. They're not pro-immigration, generally speaking. Although it won't necessarily determine their thinking, but this is what the polling suggests, that it's not high in their list of priorities. And international votes are not high on the list of priorities. And I feel like what Burnham is basically doing is he's done a deal. He's basically said, well, what I'll do is establishment, the political firmament, let me do some radical stuff domestically, and I will make sure that all the other stuff runs as it does for the next 2 to 3 years, probably for the next 5 to 10 years. And you can really see that with the defense spending, that there is going to be a massive ratcheting up of defense spending, which is really problematic because 8% of all UK imports come from Israel when it comes to defense exports. So when you're saying we're going to be increasing defense spending, what you're actually saying, the underlying message is we increase the amount of money we're going to be sending to Israel and to Elbit and Israeli defense systems, right? So this is where he's going to be bad, I think. And I think that beyond a couple of very small sort of, I'm a bit sorry, I'm a bit rueful, it's not going to change fundamentally. Can I just say one more thing? I know I've been speaking for a long time.
No, go on.
I get so pissed off with politicians who say that it's up to the courts to decide. It literally isn't.
Yeah.
It literally isn't for the courts to decide. Our arms export regime is run on a risk-based principle. It is up to our government, and it's actually up to the departments under which this falls to make a determination about whether arms are being sold according to a risk profile. Is there a risk that these arms are going to be used in war crimes? Are they going to be used in international conflicts? That is set within our own arms trade regulations. It would be mad to be a situation where you had to wait for a court to weigh in with that, because then you'd basically be like, well, we're just going to send arms to everybody and then find out 10 years too late. Of course, we have to operate in a risk principle. You can't do any forward planning or licensing if you don't operate in a risk principle. Mm-hmm. This is not the way government works.
And actually, if you wanted a court to have said something, the ICJ did say that there was a risk of genocide.
Yes.
So,
and not just that there's a risk of genocide, but that you are now bound to prevent that.
Exactly. You've got to
You've got to
prevent
take
it.
steps
Yeah.
to do it. Not just nothing. You've actually got to prevent it. And that's the key word. It's prevent. You've got to be taking active steps to prevent it, to actually give, some substance to what the ICJ is saying. What the ICJ is actually saying is you need to go in there and stop Israel doing this.
Yeah.
That's your duty. Whether it's people or whether it's shutting off the economy or whether it's putting in sanctions, you actually have a duty to do it. Now, of course, the problem is the ICJ is going to take 10
No, exactly.
10 years
It's all over by the time the ICJ gets involved.
exactly.
Yeah.
So sadly, I think that I think on this stuff, Burnham is going to be disappointing. It doesn't necessarily mean he can't be pressured, but I do also think in sort of the broader political firmament, this is the sort of place that the Greens and progressives can draw like a very clear line of difference. And this is where we stand. On foreign policy, we take an ethical approach to it. Our foreign policy approach is based on human security. That's what we care about.
And as a result of the position that you're predicting, which I think you're probably right about, though they will find it easier to take seats off of Labour in those areas that Burnham will essentially abandon.
I think that's accurate. Certainly in the short term. I mean, I'd imagine that Burnham and his allies have like a plan for reconstituting the Labour Party. I don't think it's going to work on its current trajectory because I think you need to do more to recognise cosmopolitanism in Britain as a real force, and international solidarity as a real force for our politics. My sense is that for this next electoral cycle, the Labour Party will effectively not give up, but will probably internally have a sense that they're going to lose places like Bristol. They're going to lose big parts of London. They're going to lose, Norwich. They're going to lose very substantial parts of Birmingham. But they will reconstitute some of their voting coalition outside of that.
That's
right.
I think.
And that's, I think, from a national perspective, that's a good thing. I think, because all of this suggests that the one thing that I think we are going to have to give Burnham credit for, even though I'm criticizing him here, is I think if he does the domestic stuff well, he then reduces the structural conditions that produce reform. And I think that could be a major achievement. And then that generally brings all of our politics more left-wing and more humane and more interesting and more normal.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a reform sphere, isn't it? That is what they're going to do. And in fact, it looks like they have been, to some extent, making some inroads, even though reform has been very well destroying itself in the last few months. So Burnham may have got a bit lucky there. The tiny Spanish territory of Ceuta shares a border with Morocco in North Africa. And on Thursday, a record number of migrants swam from Morocco to the enclave. Spanish officials have estimated that some 49,000 people swam around barriers to the territory, which consists largely of a single city. Given that the current population of the region is just 80,000 people, that's an overwhelming number. The migrants were mostly young Moroccan men, but included women, children, and non-Moroccans. At least 57 people have died attempting to enter Ceuta, according to the territory's president. Spain's Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, has called it an attack and a violation of Spain's territorial integrity. As a part of Spain, Ceuta is also a part of the EU. That led EU Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen to say this. The images coming from Ceuta are unacceptable. We cannot allow anyone to come to our union without abiding by our rules. Dangerous crossings must stop immediately, smuggling networks must be dismantled, and returns must be swift as our rules allow. I tasked 2 commissioners to control the situation. Returns have taken place throughout today, with 37,000 people returned to Morocco by this afternoon, according to Spanish authorities. Now, what triggered this sudden rush of people from Morocco isn't known, but the Financial Times has reported this. The influx in the coastal enclave, which has a population of about 83,000 and is hemmed in by Morocco, led analysts to suggest the Moroccan authorities had deliberately enabled a stream of migrants. Ceuta and Spain's other North African enclave, Melilla, have long been sources of tension with Morocco. Analysts see the threat of migrants overwhelming Spain's enclaves by land or sea as a key source of Rabat's leverage over Madrid. Thousands of people stormed Ceuta in 2021 after a diplomatic rift between Spain and Morocco over Western Sahara, a territory claimed by Rabat. That Doesn't explain, however, why, if true, Morocco would have enabled this mass journey of migrants at this particular moment. But in recent months, the US has also gotten involved in the dispute. In May, Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart, a key ally of US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, told a Spanish newspaper that neither territory were in the geographical territory of Spain, but rather of Morocco. Better not mention Alaska, Puerto Rico, or Hawaii, although, of course, he's not wrong in terms of geography. But those remarks were seen by some as revenge for Spain's increasingly defiant attitude to the US. Actions that irritated the Americans included denying US forces involved in the country's illegal war on Iran, use of bases on Spanish territory, and culminated in Spain closing its airspace to US military flights. Spanish ministers, including Prime Minister Sanchez, have repeatedly called the war illegal and immoral. Israel is also on very bad terms with Spain after Sanchez described the country's actions in Gaza as a genocide, imposed a total arms blockade, and called for Israel to be banned from international sport. As a result, Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, has also had a go, posting this. Spain, which never misses an opportunity to lecture Israel, has declared a state of emergency in Ceuta following the crisis over its immigration policy. Maybe before it continues lecturing us, it's time it explains to the world why it still maintains colonial enclaves in Africa. I think colonial enclaves are probably wrong, but I think you can still have colonial enclaves and criticize a country which has killed tens of thousands of children from the air. So sorry, Danny, not buying it. Morocco has continually asserted its claims to the two territories held by Spain. And when you look at the map, you can see why, with Ceuta sitting about 20 kilometers from Spain at Morocco's northernmost point. Despite that geographical distance, the British right are having a field day. Jack Davey in The Telegraph has declared the Spanish left responsible for the invasion, linking it to Sanchez's amnesty for undocumented migrants announced earlier this year. Meanwhile, GB News tried to spook its audience by describing the event as 60,000 migrants storming the Spanish border. Don't know how much geography GB News's audiences know. I didn't know about Ceuta till before today. That's a pretty incendiary way of describing the matter. This was Novara's Aaron Bassani on that channel.
But in the case of these particular enclaves, they are in Africa. I think this is really important to say. They are on the landmass of Africa. And I would submit that if you have territory like that, this will happen. Imagine, again, for a British audience, imagine if Gibraltar wasn't tied to Spain, but was tied to Afghanistan. We would have lots of Afghans trying to go there and then trying to get British citizenship. I mean, that's basically, 2 + 2 = 4 logic. So there's a problem for Spain which goes back many, many years. It's a problem for governments of the right, the left, the centre-right, or the centre-left. What I'd add is it's different in so much as, and it's unique in so much as, these aren't refugees. Morocco is a relatively successful country. So the arguments being made for them to enter Spain to get citizenship aren't the same that you would have had for Syria and Germany in 2015 or for Iranians or Afghans coming to Britain in the last 10 years. Morocco is quite a successful country, and also what was mentioned there about them being young men. They are. You can see that. There is no ambiguity here. That is overwhelmingly young, healthy men, by the way, many of which I'm sure want to make a life for themselves and work really hard and just do really well. They want opportunity. They're fit young men. You can see that. So it's a really, really unique situation. And, unless Spain ditches this territory, I think Ceuta is about 16 square kilometres. It's very, very small. And they've had it for 400 or 500 years. I'm not suggesting they should do that. But unless they do that, I don't really understand how you stop it.
Paul, I mean, like, one way of describing this situation is Moroccans going to Morocco. It's like, and national sovereignty and all of that. This is clearly just a tiny enclave that Spain has for strategic reasons. It's in a very important part where the Mediterranean, the Strait of Gibraltar is narrow, but it's not an invasion of Spain, is it? I know that there are rules that mean that like if people manage to get to the mainland, the borderless nature of Europe means that there's no sense, as far as I've seen, there's no indication that that's what people in fact want to do, and they're being moved back out of Morocco into Morocco pretty quickly.
Well, there's no sense that so First of all, just before we came on, there's been new figures being released about the numbers of returns, and also there seems to be, depending on the source you read, a lot of discussion and a lack of clarity about the number of people who actually went over the border. So, all the reporting says local estimates suggest 60,000. What local estimates? The Spanish government have said it's 49,000 people crossed over, and of which they say about 46,000 people have already returned. And it basically seems to be a message had been sent that basically through people smugglers and also to other different people, but if you come to Ceuta, then there is a possibility that there's going to be the amnesty that had been applied to other migrants. You might be able to come into the EU. There might be some sort of, and basically it's not true. People found out it wasn't true and they went back home, basically. And it seems to me like there's a lot of people trying to make and draw political inferences that are way beyond justified by what's actually happened. So one thing that happened literally again before we came on air is that Italy has suspended a Schengen agreement.
Oh, I think it said it was going to.
No,
Okay.
I mean, this is an incredibly stupid thing to do. I mean, they share a land border. Yeah. None of these people who have gone to Ceuta have then swam. You can't swim that straight. There's not an army of boats that people have gotten onto and then got onto the mainland and then are heading for the border of Italy. This feels like just it feels like there's a degree of internal EU dispute that certain EU countries, which are more right wing and have more populist leaders, look at Spain and they don't particularly like their approach to immigration. And there's been scaremongering in places like Italy and Czechoslovakia around what does this mean for the EU? And this is a political weapon for them to be using. But actually, even though it's very odd and it's awful that, one thing has been lost in the coverage, it seems to me, is that people have died, and that's awful.
Yeah, 57
people died, which is terrible. And obviously, the people who've caused that to happen should be held to account. But this idea that there's suddenly been, Spain has suddenly created this mass immigration panic in Europe is nonsense.
Yeah. It is total nonsense. I mean, I was more drawn to the sort of State Department operation angle here, and it's not just because of that congressman. It's in the American Enterprise Institute just earlier this year. This guy, I think Michael Rubin, was writing about literally this is what Morocco should do. It should use bulldozers. It should send people over. It should reclaim these territories. I think there is such a in the US right such an antagonism towards Spain. It's not just for the military stuff, the bases and the airspace over Iran, or its condemnation of Israel. It is also because of that amnesty project. If you remember that document that the State Department released last year about its sort of strategic plans for its strategy, where the focus on Europe was cultural change, and, to put it mildly, and where it was this is the most important issue facing Europe, and Spain is really kind of modelling the opposite of that.
Completely. Yeah. And I mean, that document was mad, by the way.
Totally insane.
Totally insane. The most pulled out of Elon Musk's brain, clash of civilizations nonsense. Which, I mean, if I remember correctly, basically said that Europe is no longer a strategic partner because it's not white enough, basically.
That was pretty. That was the gist,
European civilization is collapsing because it's got too many immigrants. Yeah. And the interesting thing is actually the experience in Spain has been quite interesting because they take a different approach on all sorts of different things. They're one of the few EU countries that is experiencing significant economic growth.
Yeah. And people are asking why.
It's basically immigration. Especially
but they acknowledged that in the amnesty. He said, this is why we're doing it. We're doing it because these people will grow our economy over time.
Yeah.
He was very clear about it, Sanchez.
And basically what it's done is it's shown... we're also living in this very bizarre time where basically Europe is going to be undergoing a pretty profound demographic crisis. And Spain has basically said, yeah, we are going to go through this demographic crisis. We're going to drop some of the racism that stops us from actually dealing with this in pragmatic terms. And we are going to have immigrants and we're going to empower them and give them the ability to build lives. And they will, generally speaking, knuckle down and they'll work hard and they'll advance their economy. I mean, generally speaking, you can't have, this. I do wonder, I mean, this is a random stray thought that I've had. So let's throw it out there. It might be just total nonsense, right? As whether neoliberalism has like destroyed the understanding of labor. It's destroyed the concept of like, you don't have economic growth without people.
Yeah.
Like fundamentally, like I was thinking about this the other day because John Healey was giving a press conference, and he said, it was to business people, and he said, I'm so glad to see you all here. You guys are the wealth creators. And I was so furious by that statement. I was like, no, they're literally not the wealth creators. And you're the Labour Party. It used to be doctrine in the Labour Party that the people who create wealth is Labour. That's actually who creates wealth. And it feels like people have lost sight of that. That you do fundamentally all economic growth is based on human endeavor until such time was replaced by robots, and then it's a different discussion altogether. But it's, we've got this idea that you could grow an economy indefinitely, which you probably shouldn't be doing anyway, without people, without young people, without people who are going to be working. And we're not having, even in the UK, like actually serious, mature conversations about like, well, if we're not creating the conditions for people to be having lots of children, and we are relying on immigration, then maybe from a working class and from a class solidarity perspective, if you're going to be bringing in loads of people to work for you and then not give them any rights, which is basically what Shabana Mahmood is doing, you are going to be affecting everybody's class position in a negative way. What Spain has basically done is, they attacked us. They're running like a laissez-faire economy, allowing immigrants. What they've actually effectively done is they've said to 1 million people, you now have workers' rights. You've now been regularized. You now can't be abused by your employer. That's actually what that process does. It's not actually just about you are now Spanish. It's actually now you have Spanish rights. You have rights under EU law. You can't be working 16, 18 hours a day and undermining the wages of older people here. And that's actually the way you bring people on side in an immigration debate.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's interesting the thing you said about neoliberalism and the notion of labour. I've had like a thought recently from the other side, which is neoliberalism has also like convinced everyone that governments can't do anything anymore. It's like this feature of like what I like to call like the clapped right. You used to think of like the right in politics as somehow being like the engine of innovation and whatever. And now every right-wing person is like, you suggest, oh, maybe we could do this. And they're just like, we can't do anything. And it's really like, only corporations can do these things. Only companies can do these things. But like, we can't do anything.
Well, first of all, corporations can't do most things they promise they're going to do.
Yeah.
But, I've had this conversation. This is going to be a bit of a weird tangent. But have you ever read The Three-Body Problem?
Yes.
Right, okay. Now, very interesting series of books, sci-fi books. The thing that really struck me about it, I was like, what's it going to be like? I've never actually read like a Chinese novel, maybe A.B. Tan. I'll read this and see what it's like. And the thing that like is actually the most sci-fi aspect of that novel is like it goes through all these different phases of like human endeavor as it plans for this particular, there's an engagement of how we're going to deal with aliens, and there's multiple different human responses. And every human response is like, we built amazing underground cities that look like trees and leaves. And I was like, well, hold on a second. Where is your belief in human engineering coming from? I was like, oh, this is like a Chinese author. This is a Chinese perspective, actually.
You can do anything.
You can do anything. Actually, the state is going to build these massive underground cities with leaves and trees and stuff like that. And it made me think like there really has been the sense, and it was a created sense, it's a manufactured sense that the state is bad at doing stuff.
Yeah.
And basically,
I mean, it is sometimes bad at doing stuff.
It is. I mean, the famous example that was always used to defend neoliberalism was the Spanish phone network. So not Spanish, the Mexican phone network, which was a nationalized phone network where it took you 2 years to get a phone connection. And that was always held up as like, this shows you why like monopolies are bad. Why, if you have 5 different phone networks, then, you'll get better services, which might be true for certain types of things. It's very much not true for water. It's very much not true for like long-term like infrastructure development. It's certainly not true for like doing anything that might be good for humanity that doesn't necessarily turn a profit, like build the internet, right? Like, but I think you're right. There is the sense that, and maybe that's why Burnham is so interesting as a character.
Because he thinks the state can do things.
Well, so he's the first person who's basically said the computer says yes.
Yeah, exactly. And
like, well, we actually can do
that
this.
clapped right hates it. Because they're so sort of, convinced of the absolute impossibility of anything ever changing.
But also they will also at the same time, this is the hypocrisy in like well, not the hypocrisy, but certainly the disjuncture in the thinking is that they'll also then hark back to an imagined Great Britain, which is all about the state. Like the things they'll be thinking about is like our response to World War II. Well, we only privatized our defense industry in the 1980s, which is a disaster, by the way. We should never have done that for all sorts of different reasons. But like the war response to the Second World War, that's state-driven. The NHS is a state entity. After World War II, greatest boom in living standards, the state basically nationalized like 60% of the economy and built amazing, amazing, amazing things. I just feel like I remember seeing something it was Rivka Brown, Novara, who did that article, which I thought was so interesting about Finnish trains.
That's, I guess.
And it went like totally viral around the world. And I was like, this is what happens when the state just spends some money on infrastructure. And I was actually speaking to Americans, and they were like, I thought that all trains just had to be absolutely awful, covered in like rats, look like a hellscape. And, you basically go into like an underground apocalyptic world where you may not emerge. And it's like, oh no, you can actually just build nice things if you put some money into it and you have some, project management skills.
All right, well, that was all a bit of a tangent, a great one, interesting one from Quetta. Let's go on to our last story. Britain's first black woman MP and the mother of the House, Diane Abbott, has finally been readmitted to the Labour Party. That's after her suspension was lifted by Prime Minister Andy Burnham's new chief whip, Annalisa Midgley, following the completion of an internal process. So what was Abbott alleged to have done? The suspension relates to a letter Abbott published in The Observer back in 2023, in which she claimed that Irish people, Jewish people and travellers suffered from prejudice, which, while similar to racism, is not in fact racism, which she appeared to define as relating only to skin colour. Those groups, she said, quote, are not all their lives subject to racism. That letter got her into hot water, and though Abbott apologised at the time, then leader of the party, Keir Starmer, withdrew the whip. The whip was then restored in May 2024, and just a month before the July general election, Abbott was confirmed as the party's candidate for her seat in Hackney North, although it was very clear to outsiders that the Parliamentary Labour Party were doing everything in their power to stop her from being that candidate. But in July last year, Abbott appeared on Radio 4, where, according to some, she reiterated the points she'd made in the letter. And we'll come to that radio interview in just a moment. She also posted around the same time and very quickly deleted, a tweet in which she called the IDF the Jewish Defence Forces. Later that month, she was suspended from the Labour Party again, with a senior party official telling the paper it was unlikely she'd ever be readmitted to the party. Well, how wrong they were. In a statement posted online on Thursday, Abbott said this. Today, following a process conducted in line with party rules and approved by the independent review process, I have been readmitted to the Labour Party. I've been issued with a formal warning for a tweet I previously posted. By inadvertently referring to the Israeli Defence Force as the Jewish Defence Force, I used wording that conflates the actions of the State of Israel with the Jewish community. I am deeply sorry for any hurt caused by that conflation and apologise for any hurt caused by it. I have been and remain a lifelong anti-racist and remain deeply committed to opposing racism in all of its forms. Now, you'd think that would be that, except on Thursday night, Newsnight dedicated more than half the programme to Abbott's readmission to the party. And it began with the show's political editor, Nicholas Watt, revealing he had a pretty one-sided Labour Party contact book.
I am hearing unease amongst Labour MPs who are supportive of the Jewish community. One of them I spoke to and they said, oh my God, for God's sake, they said to me, they talked about real disappointment. I spoke to another Labour MP. They said to me, this is absolutely outrageous. They fear that this could be a step backwards. And they were particularly uneasy that this has happened during the recess when there's no ability for Labour MPs to walk up to their whip immediately and say, what is going on there? Amongst members of the Jewish Labour movement, they are supportive and have confidence in Andy Burnham, but one said to me they were worried that this could provide a pretext for those on the left, those who still have admiration for Jeremy Corbyn, that they could say, in the words of this person, let's overcome the injustice that was done to people who were removed from the Labour Party over allegations of anti-Semitism, worried about that. I was speaking to Dame Louise Ellman, of course a formerly prominent Labour MP who left the Labour Party over the anti-Semitism allegations and then came back at the invitation of Keir Starmer. She was slightly concerned by the wording of Diane Abbott's statement today. So the adverse finding against Diane Abbott, which led her to apologise, was a tweet a year ago in which she described the Israeli Defence Forces as the Jewish Defence Forces. She apologised for that because there was an adverse finding on that. And then this is what Diane Abbott said. I am deeply sorry for any hurt caused by that conflation and apologise for any hurt caused by it. And it was the use of the word any that Louise Ellman picked up on. And Louise Ellman, this is what she said to me. There have been a succession of unfortunate errors in relation to Diane's perception of Jewish people. I'm not sure whether she understands the mistake she's made or whether she has found a form of words to allow the whip to be restored.
So I guess the implication of that is that the use of the any suggests somehow that Abbott doesn't really mean it and has just found a kind of formalistic form of words which allows it to be restored. I mean, I'm not really sure how you can, infer that from the apology. It's just the use of the word any her. I would also say any her if I was apologising to somebody. I didn't really understand that inference there. But what we do know is that Abbott wasn't required to apologise over the remarks she made on Radio 4 about racism. So that was followed when she had the whip restored after the original suspension over the Observer article. She then, a little while later, went on the radio and made some remarks that we're going to come to. And those remarks haven't been she doesn't seem to have had to apologise for those. They don't seem to have, that doesn't seem to have been a finding about those remarks on the radio programme. This was now Phil Rosenberg, president of the Board of Jewish Deputies, giving his take.
Well, I'm very sad and very concerned. I'm sad because in many ways Diane Abbott is an icon, the longest serving female MP, the first black female MP.
Mother of the House.
Mother of the House. And so you'd hope that we would find common cause in fighting racism in all its different guises. But over and over again, she's making these statements that are offensive to the Jewish community at a time when there is heightened anti-Semitism, deadly anti-Semitism, as we saw at Heaton Park. And just completely false statements. When the Nazis developed their racial prejudice laws, they were basing them on discrimination against African-American people under the Jim Crow laws. Jews and black people should be fighting racism together. And unfortunately, Diane Abbott over and over again makes these comments and then doubles down on them. And just once again, she's apologised for the thing.
Well, she didn't double down this time. She actually apologised for the tweet.
She apologised, but not for the original thing that she had doubled down for.
Right.
And I'm just really sad. And I'm concerned because, as you were implying, we've seen this movie before. And it doesn't end well for the Jewish community, and it doesn't end well for Labour.
So that was a reference to Abbott apparently doubling down on her original comments in the Observer about racism in that later Radio 4 interview. That also became the subject of a heated exchange between Newsnight's presenter Adam Fleming and Labour MP Bel Ribeiro Addy.
Something that was said earlier that was wrong, talking about the interview that she did, saying that Diane said in the interview that she had done nothing wrong. I think this is where some of the issues arise, where sometimes, the wrong sense is taken out of what Diane had said. She didn't say that. And she actually reiterated she said she stood by her apology that she made regarding the Observer letter in that same interview. So it's very strange that it was reported in that way and that you've reported it that way today.
Well, no, just so people are clear, if you go back and listen to the Jim Naughtie programme, which was broadcast on Radio 4 last year, he says to Diane Abbott, do you regret what you said in that letter? And she said no. And that is what led to her being suspended this latest time.
The thing is, I think you actually have to listen to the whole interview because I think the way in which it was clipped following her saying no, she was referring to what he had asked her before, whether or not she was clear on the fact that people experience racism differently. She also said that she stands by the apology that she gave after having written the letter. So I think you have to listen to it in its full context. And regardless of trying to pick at these particular things, Diane has been very clear about where she's offending somebody, offending a group of people, being apologetic of it and understanding what has gone wrong. And everybody knows that Diane is someone who has challenged all forms of racism.
That exchange continued.
But Belle, we're not picking at these things, in your words. We're reflecting genuine concern.
That particular interview, I'm saying if you wanted to refer to anything else that has been said, which I must note she's gone and apologized for, I would like to say if you listen to the interview properly, as many people have, what people inferred from it and what was reported from it was not entirely accurate. That is all I'm saying. And Diane has been very, very clear about her apology, her initial apology, and the apology that she's reiterated today. She's very pleased to be back in the Labour Party. And I think you'll find that many people are pleased that she is. Also, 35,000 people signed a petition saying that she should be reinstated. And I think that's an important thing to note.
Belle, just before you interrupted me, which is the wrong way around for these things to work, I think, in TV news, I was going to say, we're not just picking at things she said in interviews and fixating on them. Nick has been reflecting back genuine concern from your colleagues in Labour about how this has been handled.
I'm making a point about specifically.
So answer the point I'm making now.
I'm making a point specifically about what you have said in terms of picking at
you
things.
made that point, and I'm asking you to make a different point about your colleagues tonight and how they're feeling about this.
No, I have no issue with my colleagues having concerns, and I think it's right for them to express it. I was talking about your point. Let's be very, very clear that I was talking about what you had said in regards to the interview.
Let's not get hung up on that. Yes.
No, but it's important to make to make a proper statement when you're reflecting back on something that someone has said. So to now try and say that I have said that an entire community's issues should, or members of my colleagues should be, my colleagues' issues shouldn't be of any concern. That is also not something.
No, I'm giving you a chance.
So I actually don't agree with Rabira Addy's take on the interview, which we're going to listen to in a minute. But I do think she was like super sharp to catch that slide that was being made between her sort of arguing about the meaning of the interview and the interviewer sort of then making it sound as though perhaps she was also dismissing concerns of MPs and the Jewish community. I think that was a very sharp catch there. But look, let's have a listen to the 2025 interview and see if Abbott really did double down on the Observer letter.
You got into terrible trouble for a letter you wrote to the Observer about racism. And you appeared to suggest, in the view of some of your critics anyway, that the kind of anti-Semitism that the Jewish community suffered, or travellers suffered, or Irish people suffered, was somehow different from the racism that you as a young black person had suffered. You were suspended and there was a great hoo-ha. Do you look back on that with regret?
No, not at all. Clearly, there must be a difference between racism, which is about colour, and other types of racism, because you can see a traveller or a Jewish person walking down the street. You don't know. You don't know unless you stop to speak to them or you're in a meeting with them. But if you see a black person walking down the street, you see straight away that they're black. They are different types of racism.
But the effect is the same. If you are going to a synagogue on a Saturday morning and you have to have guards outside because some people might come along and want to insult you or even throw things at you, that's pretty much the same as the kind of thing you describe in your book as happening to you as a black person. The fact is, one is a person of colour and one isn't. Is neither here nor there. If you suffer it, it's still damaging.
It is here because you can spot that person of colour from hundreds of yards away. That is what is different.
You withdrew the thing. You said, look, if this is misunderstood, as you thought it was, then I apologise for it. But fundamentally, you don't believe you did anything wrong, or you didn't attempt to say something that you didn't believe.
I just think that it's silly to try and claim that racism, which is about skin colour, is the same as other types of racism. I don't know why people would say that.
But you would, I assume, condemn anti-Semitic behaviour in the same way that you would condemn racist behaviour against someone simply because of the colour of their skin.
Well, of course. And I do get a bit weary of people trying to pin the anti-Semitic label on me because I've spent a lifetime fighting racism of all kinds, and in particular fighting anti-Semitism, partly because of the nature of my constituency.
So I think it's fairly subtle. It was not actually even subtle at all, actually. She said one thing in the Observer article, which was that racism was one thing and prejudice was a different thing, and they were easily mistaken for one another, but, you know, Jewish people, travellers, the Irish don't experience racism, they only experience prejudice. And she also compared it to like the experience, you know, she'd used redheads as an example of experiencing prejudice. That was a mistake. Here in this interview, she's not actually saying any of that. She's just saying that actually there are differences in the way that racism is enacted and experienced, and that some racism, you know, is a result of directly the way that somebody looks. And on LBC, caller Barry rang into the studio to give pretty much that take on the Abbott case.
People didn't hear the words she said, partly because she's a black woman. So they dismissed her. So they refused to hear the fact that she said that other people face prejudice. They do face prejudice. It doesn't mean that it's worse or it's better. It just means that it is. I'm a black man, and when I walk down the street, it doesn't matter that I'm almost 50 years old, people will still cross the road. They will still cross the road, they will still grab their handbags. I ask the question, are they being careful or are they being prejudiced? I've heard MPs say that they don't like black and brown faces on TV. Too many on adverts. There was some outrage, but you know what? There wasn't the same clamour. They don't go on about it. She's okay now. She's still an MP. My racism is literally on my skin.
Yeah.
Yours, yes, yes, people are treated differently for other reasons, but mine is superficial.
Paul, I'm not surprised that Abbott they didn't find anything wrong with what she said on the radio, because I think what she said on the radio was completely true, and it was different from the clumsily phrased thing and potentially false thing that she said in the Observer. I think that, you know, it seems, as she said, fairly obvious that there are different types of racisms which are just responses to different features of people. All of them are racism, but they're experienced differently and they are triggered differently.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to have her back in the party. In the Labour Party, what do you think about this?
This whole thing is, you know, it pissed me off so much, to be honest, excuse my language, like watching all this again happening. It's like the most bad faith interpretation of what Diane Abbott was trying to say and has been trying to say for a very long time, which is an incredibly simple, straightforward, really uncontroversial point. Pretty much anywhere in the world outside of like the hermetically sealed nonsense of the Labour Party, where like these issues become just distorted beyond any sort of reasonable interpretation, and you know, it's filtering into a political process. It's basically so toxified, this discourse, you can't have a serious conversation. So I think, you know, the first things first we have to do is like straighten out what happened. She sent the letter to the Observer where she was trying to make the point that there are differences in the ways the prejudice express, depending on the axis on which the prejudice happens. So if you're a black person, it's on your skin, people will respond to you. If you're Jewish, you might not be visibly Jewish. You might not be noticed unless you're wearing a kippah. So you might be able to, you won't experience racism in the same way. That's a totally uncontroversial thing to say, that different types of prejudice express themselves differently. Just in the same way that anti-black racism, the types of stereotypes that will be associated with blackness is different to the types of stereotypes that will be associated with people who are Jewish and who are Muslim, because they're all culturally determined by different historical processes. You know, black people, you know, growing up in South Africa and apartheid, like the racism towards black people is that they're thick, that they are smelly, that they are different, that they're animalistic. The type of prejudice that's shown towards Jewish people is that they are too smart for their own good, that they are malevolent operators because they're loan sharks, they're Shylocks, and Muslims, you know, now the culturally created prejudice around them is that they, you know, that Islam is a fundamentally violent religion. These people who deep down, regardless of what country they live in, actually have a Muslim gene that makes them want to do Sharia law everywhere. Like, obviously different types of prejudice expressed differently because all prejudice is socially constructed, and it's socially constructed at different times by different people for different reasons, usually economic domination. That's the key thing, right? So Diane Abbott's first edit to the Observer is plainly clumsily written.
Yeah.
She clearly says something that underplays the extent and consequence of anti-Jewish prejudice, obviously.
The redheads thing was crazy.
Yeah, obviously. And she immediately apologizes for it, right? And she says, I'm really sorry. This was a drafting error. I sent through a draft of this letter that was wrong. I was dealing with my staff member. I meant to send through a later draft where he corrected it and the wrong one got in. Of course, the question becomes like, why did the Observer run this letter they knew didn't reflect her views? That's a different discussion. But she immediately apologized, right? And in that moment, the key issue was, well, how do you deal with an apology from Diane Abbott versus somebody like Steve Reed? Because Steve Reed made incredibly clumsy comments about Jewish businessmen, and he was immediately absolved. He was like, it's fine, you made a mistake. We are going to, part of what drives so much British politics is basically who gets the benefit of the doubt in a situation like this. Steve Reed immediately got the benefit of the doubt. Diane Abbott didn't. And Diane Abbott didn't get the benefit of the doubt for all sorts of reasons, not least racism, but also not least because the people who didn't want to give the benefit of the doubt were the same people who make the decision about whether she's suspended or not, right? Now, that happens, they take a year to investigate a letter, which is apologized for, which is an absurdity, and is plainly designed to humiliate her. There's simply no reason for it to take a year to investigate her. And they clear her, and they lie about her repeatedly in that year. Keir Starmer gives an interview where he says, one of the first things I did when I came in as leader is I didn't get involved in this. She's still going, this is an independent process. I have no role in this. By the time that he gave that interview, she'd already been cleared by the party of wrongdoing. She'd gone through a process. All that happened was for the whip to be restored. They repeatedly lied about it. Then we had the Frank Hester situation where she's racially, there's a horrible thing that Frank Hester says. There's a discussion in Parliament where she's the only person not called to give a discussion about it. Really treated her abominably, right?
And then he makes a big show of sort of going over, right?
Yeah. And she says, and there's a conversation, he says, like, anything I can do. She's like, give me the goddamn whip back. And basically she has to fight tooth and nail and mobilize like a large left-wing constituency, predominantly black in her constituency, to make sure she can actually just stand as the MP, and she wins that battle. Then she gives this interview to the BBC where plainly what she's saying is, I stand by the original point that I was making, which is entirely uncontroversial.
It's so obvious that's what she's saying, yeah.
It's so obvious what she's saying is like, she's not saying, oh, I actually meant the originally worded Observer letter. She's saying, the point that I was trying to make is that different types of racism and prejudice express themselves, which is why I find Phil Rosenberg's comments so disgusting. Really pisses me off. This idea that she's not actually standing in solidarity with Jewish people by saying, actually, we should be sensitive to the unique ways in which anti-Semitism, anti-black racism are exposed, is fundamentally showing you're sensitive to the issue of anti-Semitism. Yeah. Like, it pisses me off that he's even using that moment to imply, as far as I can understand, that he's saying that she's actually drawing some sort of negative distinction between the black and the Jewish community, and she's trying to draw a wedge. She's not. She's saying these are different experiences, and we can have a conversation about that, right? The other thing that drives me mad, and I've got a lot of things to get off my chest here, you can tell. I'm on a roll. The thing that pisses me off about Newsnight so much, and I put this on Twitter today, and I've been trying to take a bit of a Twitter holiday for the last couple of days. But before the book came out, the first big story that I wanted to release was about Paul Ovenden. Now, Paul Ovenden was, at the time the book came out, the chief of the head of strategy at Number 10. He'd been in the Labour Comms department for a long time. And I had these messages from 2014, 2015, where he's saying utterly despicable things about Diane Abbott. He's telling another female staffer, white female staffer in this conversation, recounting basically getting drunk with other staffers the night before, then having a game of sex, marry, kill about Diane Abbott, and then making sexualized comments about it, really quite disgusting stuff. This stuff is plainly in the public interest, right? And we know it's in the public interest because when I took it to a proper news outlet, they actually published it, and immediately he resigned. Yeah. Right. And the reason it's in the public interest is because you can't have somebody who's the head of strategy saying these things about black people and about Diane Abbott, right? Now, the first people I took that story to was Newsnight. I took the story to them, I think it was in August last year. And for 6 weeks, Newsnight told me they were interested. They didn't run the story. And every conversation I had, and I'm not going to name the person I spoke to, was like, oh, very nicey, and we think it's such an important story, but we're having editorial discussions. And by the end of it, I basically got the message. It was like, you're just not going to touch this. Then I went to ITV, they ran it in 3 days, right? So Newsnight has a consistent pattern of misrepresenting and misreporting on Diane Abbott and not giving the alternative version, right? So even in that platform, even in that panel right there, 5, 6 white people talking about racism. Why on earth isn't Martin Ford on that panel? Martin Ford has repeatedly been asked to give, discussions about Diane Abbott. He's worked at Diane Abbott. He's helped to try and navigate some of her disciplinary issues. Why isn't he being brought on board to discuss this issue? Instead, we have this entirely tone-deaf discussion, which misrepresents what Diane Abbott says. The other thing, Really, the reason she was resuspended is because of the BBC. Because what actually happened at that moment is, if you listen to that interview, it's plain what she's saying. The BBC clipped that interview in socials to make it sound like she was saying she didn't regret sending that letter, which wasn't true. And immediately as that happened, she was suspended again. There was a direct line between them posting a misleading thing on socials and Diane Abbott being suspended. So we have a situation where they are repeatedly misrepresenting what she says. They're getting people on board who are also, I think, giving the worst faith interpretation of what she has to say. They are giving no countervailing opinions. There's not a single person on that panel who's not white to speak about it. And this is also in the context in which they have been given hard evidence of serious misconduct by a senior Labour official in government about Diane Abbott, and they haven't run that story. Like, I don't think at this point, I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, this is not an isolated incident. This is a cultural problem within Newsnight, that they are, for some reason, unable to report accurately and sensitively on this issue. And if they were able to report accurately and sensitively on this issue, it wouldn't be in half an hour, half of the episode. It'd be a 2-minute discussion. And part of that discussion would be, this person has said 2 things in their life, 2 things in a life that's 80 years long, that you don't like on social media. And you think that counts more than 80 years of anti-racist practice. I mean, it's outrageous sort of stuff. It's outrageous stuff. And the BBC really should be ashamed of their conduct. Should be ashamed of their conduct back in 2024. Back in 2024, she suspended. They should be ashamed of what they did there.
Paul, thank you very much for that. And thank you for joining me tonight. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.